going through some qualitative research methods. I know that you've already had the session on, I've had a few sessions now, so we're kind of just building on our knowledge, and hopefully we'll just get a bit of a flavor of what kinds of things you can do with qualitative research. And we won't go too much into details of how we're going to analyze the data or anything like that, but at this stage, it's just working out how we can use this kind of structure and what kinds of things may come up in this way of acquiring knowledge. So to start us off with, I think the most important things to kind of figure out would be, what exactly are we kind of talking about? Like, what's the objective here? So when you kind of think about non-quantitative or qualitative research methods, I think people are kind of used to this idea of it being, well, it's a survey, it's something different, it's something that you use to try and answer things that aren't really objective questions. An easy example of this might be when if you go to see a patient, you try and get them to tell you that a pain score out of 10, but fundamentally it's so variable. There is no way to know what an 8 out of 10 means amongst 10 different people. You can try and be as numerical as you like, but that experience cannot be quantified sufficiently for it to be a numerical kind of answer that can be standardized amongst millions of people. So when that happens, what exactly do you do? How can you kind of figure out something that is more abstract than just kind of obviously natural phenomena in the world? That's where we have to use qualitative research methods. It's more about understanding the natural phenomena of the world. You're not looking to, the reason why this research method is unique is because you're not looking to try and tell people this is how many people have X disease, or this is, you're not trying to answer a super specific hypothesis-based question. Qualitative research methods fundamentally rely on the idea that we accept that we accept that whatever is going on in our line of questioning of whatever I'm trying to answer, we're not looking to find out how it, what exactly is there. It's the nuance here is that you're trying to you're not trying to change anything. You're just trying to put some context into it and to understand what exactly is going on. Which is why, honestly, it's one of the more challenging things to pursue in research. So, and to kind of quantify to kind of put a good context as to how this can be so challenging, it's important to go through what exactly are the kind of main ways of getting this knowledge. Okay. So the first one is ethnography. It's an anthropological technique, and it is notoriously difficult to achieve, but also it has great value in the understandings of different cultures. So the way this works is an anthropologist will choose to explore some kind of cultural phenomenon. Obviously, I think historically, and even up to maybe 50 odd years ago, it's been quite commonly used as a colonialist tool. So you would have sent anthropologists to different countries and tried to figure out what kind of indigenous cultures existed there, and it would be very challenging for them, because as say an American going off to like somewhere like Fiji or wherever, it can be quite difficult to lose your own culture and your own biases about the world and try and approach what these other cultures do and how they live their life and the social factors they surround themselves in. So fundamentally, it's a very challenging thing to do, but the main aim of it is to take cultural knowledge from one group without instilling any of your own biases or any of the things that you might consider a faux pas, which is normal for you. And that's where there's a lot of nuance that's required and a lot of unlearning, which sounds a bit ironic, but you've got to drop what you think you know before you can learn what these guys do. And that also applies in it doesn't have to be in some kind of big study of an abandoned kind of, you know, untouched civilization somewhere in the Amazon. It can be, this also applies to patients. This can apply to, you know, I think there's been a lot of really good anthropological studies in medicine regarding experiences of pain, of, you know, like motherhood. I think there's one that I heard of a few weeks ago where someone was talking about different cultural perceptions of obesity, and these can be very different, and these can really depend on where you come from, what you can learn over your lifetime, and it's not possible to try and quantify these things because you'll never truly know what each individual person is kind of going through to led them to what they're saying to you. What you can do, however, is capture what they've told you as best as possibly you can, and then from there you can try and understand what may have led them to say that, or what may have motivated them to make the decisions that they've made so far. And it's that focus on the kind of decision making and the process pathway that makes quantitative research so valuable. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what ethnography is. A phenomenology is a bit more of a philosophical kind of knowledge-based concept, but fundamentally it's kind of relying along the same things. You're kind of deeply probing individual experiences of certain phenomenon and how, you know, if there may be any patterns among them, or more specifically, again, why they're trying to do those things. It's about understanding. And to give you guys an example of what that might look like. So in a normal kind of clinical scenario, you might ask yourself something along the lines of, you know, does virtual teaching versus in-person teaching have any impact on how people do in exams? And that would be quite easy to assess in a quantitative fashion. If you want to have a go at it, just put something down in the chat and we can have a discussion about how you might try and understand this from that perspective. But what you'll kind of learn is that you can't do that with qualitative research. It's not a question that can be answered that way, because there are objective answers to this. You know that one group will have X scores on average, and you know that the other group will have Y scores on average, and you can't get around that. It's just probably a level of objectivity that you will need and that you can actually afford to get from your results. And you know, there's no kind of way of saying one method is superior over the other. It's just each tool helps you answer a different question. So okay, so now that you kind of get, there's obvious questions that should be answered with an objective lens. So then what kind of questions would you want to answer in a less objective and a more qualitative lens? In the same kind of vein, I would say, well, a qualitative research question may be along the lines of, well, how do the medical students decide if they would prefer online or in-person learning resources? And then at that point, you kind of think, well, this isn't something that can be objectified. So we need to understand the phenomenon behind decision-making pathway, what factors are important to these students, and how do they lead to the decision between two different learning opportunities. And for that, you've got to, you know, you've got to undertake some kind of qualitative research, and you've got to open yourself up to the subjective nature of their decision. Could be based on anything, literally anything, but you've got to be able to take that down. You've got to be able to understand it. You've got to be able to be as descriptive as possible about it, but you can't influence it as a researcher. and it's a complicated thing to get your head around, but it's vital to do good qualitative research. Then the last thing is kind of grounded theory. Grounded theory is basically, it's as close to experimentation as you can physically get in this realm. And don't quote me on that one. But basically, it kind of sounds, if you look at this diagram, it really does sound a bit like the scientific method. You collect your data, you code it up into different patterns, and different insights that you might get from the data, and then obviously from there you'll try and build a general overall insight that you're kind of getting from across this breadth of data that you've gathered. So it's, however, I will say that grounded theory is probably the most commonly used methodology, and it's probably the most useful for social processes because it's quite iterative. You're going to do concurrent data collection, but also concurrent data processing. So as that's where the revision step, step 3, theoretical sampling, is so important, because as you're collecting more data, you can start coding it, and you can start thinking about, well, actually, what are we learning from this, and how does this influence what we're getting out of the data collection? As an example, I think I should just kind of contextualize this and say, well, I'll give you another complete random example. So let's say we talk about what kinds of things, or what kinds of what aspects of being on placements can be challenging for, towards professional behavior in medical students. So that might be, it could be anything. It genuinely could be, it could be parts of the curriculum, it could be parts of the student's personal life. There's no real limit on what that could involve. But without a structure of, going to collect data from students and then analyzing it, and then, just that will help you to feed through data better. And eventually you'll come with an overall kind of, we interviewed X amount of students, and we found that they said this, they told us about their problems with the curriculum, they told us about their personal lives, and it will help you categorize and structure your theory better. But fundamentally, these are kind of philosophical ways of understanding knowledge, but these aren't necessarily the things you would do on a day-to-day basis, if that makes sense. It's more like, these are the frameworks by which your knowledge will be obtained. To kind of explain that a bit better, I'm going to go on to the ways in which you can kind of gather your information. So fundamentally, qualitative research is an observational pathway. You're always going to be looking at how you can learn from others as a completely neutral bystander. You yourself will not necessarily be changing anything or doing anything crazy. It's all about letting the environment kind of just run its own natural course whilst you observe, you make notes, you speak to people. You're not changing anything, you're just taking in what's going on. So for the kind of most obvious thing that you can do, and this is literally the majority of ethnographies, participation in the setting. You see these very vivid accounts of people getting involved, and they'll move to Bali for 3 months and go live with indigenous people, and they will immerse themselves in that culture so that they have a rich experience to talk about when they want to describe cultural phenomenon or social practice, because they have seen it as if they were one of that community. They have to be accepted within the team, so to speak. And then only can they have an honest reflection of what that would be like for someone who is already of that community. Then obviously you have direct observation. It's similar to participation, but it's obviously not the same, because it's not as rich of a data source. But again, very commonly seen amongst all three types of qualitative data framework that I kind of discussed. You will expect to just take a keen eye on everything that's going on, slowly figure out what's important to these people you're observing. And again, most challenging parts of things like this is you have to drop your own ideas and preconceptions. You've got to be complete as neutral as possible, and it's just learn and observe. Then, so the first two are kind of just hands off, like we're just going to watch, we're going to get involved in the community, we're not going to do anything, we're not going to change anything. They're almost all observational, and then you write up your observation, you write down what you found from your own perspective. Whereas the next two are more writing up what other people tell you. So interviews and focus groups, they can be kind of overlapping, but fundamentally you're getting data from asking people questions. So those questions may be personal questions, they may be whatever, they could be anything, but they're individual questions. And again, in light with everything else that we've said so far, they're all designed to get qualitative data that is personal and not aiming to you're not aiming to prove anything. You're just aiming to categorize and explain what is already going on. So, for example, with the whole the question we asked earlier about, how do we decide if people want to use virtual or in-person teaching? You might just have a group of people and ask them, well, what kinds of things do you look to do when you're studying? Or how do you value how do you value your time when you're studying? Or what kinds of things might matter to you in terms of, do they believe that being virtual is convenient to them? And is the convenience worth losing the interactivity of being in person with someone? It's asking these kind of questions that allow you to understand their perspective, but in a way that doesn't imbibe your own perspective onto the question. So it's about being as neutral as possible. It's open questions, basically, which after so many years of history taking, you'll get to it. And then the last of all the methods that we're going to discuss, this is analysis of documents and materials. It's, again, very observational. It's just, you almost kind of take things, it's like when you do a clinical case study. You've got to read the notes, you've got to understand what's going on. And you're not looking to generalize anything, you're not looking to create anything profound that can be used to every single human alive. It's more about exploring the fruits of the knowledge in one particular situation, so that for other people who are in a similar situation at some point in the future, they have something to look back on, something that they can read, and they can see that in a similar situation, this was what was obtained from similar studies of qualitative material. An example of that I might give you would be if you want to ask about certain operative factors that a surgeon might feel about doing certain procedures. It might be useful to do a study of relevant documentation in terms of the surgeon's reflections and their notes about the surgery, because that will give you an insight as to how they were performing it and what kind of things they were going through, how long it took them, what if they had any challenges whilst doing it, and so forth. It can be a very good tool to get knowledge that you might not notice as an observer, because you don't know what they were thinking about that to that level of detail. And also sometimes you might miss these things on an interview, because human recollection is fallible. People don't always remember everything that they're told or everything they've experienced. Whereas documentation can be a fresh, different perspective that can be more useful. So the main thing that I'm super keen on kind of embedding into this talk, so that you understand what's really super key, is developing the right research question and developing the right tool to answer them. So everyone's kind of used to the scientific method. It's very standard for clinical practice. You know, you get used to this idea of, right, I have a question about, I don't know, you know, does paracetamol do better than a random NSAID in pain reduction? So, you know, you might go in thinking, well, the NSAID's going to be better. And that's your hypothesis. And then you'll create some kind of study to design to figure out if that's true. It could be a randomized control trial. It could be whatever. It could be a lab-based study, whatever that may be. And by whatever metric you have decided to gauge better with, you are completely within reason to use the data to analyze and to give you an answer within that metric. If you decide to say, well, it's, you know, it's how they perform, if it's their quality of life, whatever it may be, once you've defined your metrics and you can justify why you're using them, the analysis is as simple as, well, these patients did better, therefore this outcome was better, therefore this intervention was better. So, you know, the conclusions kind of follow on naturally from the question, provided that you have the right evidence to answer them. And fundamentally, with the scientific method, it's the objectivity of it. It's this idea that studies can be replicated, and that, you know, the evidence is only as good as the model that proves best what you're trying to identify. If someone was to try your method in some other situation, it didn't work, that lack of generalization would hit upon the validity of what you found. And arguably, someone who found something that was more robust and could be applied in more situations or more accurately will probably be closer to an objective truth. So you might consider, well, did I do something wrong, or did they do something improving on my method? Either of which is possible and valid. But fundamentally, that doesn't apply in qualitative research. There is no necessary kind of hypothesis you're answering. You're not looking to solve any problem. You're not looking to understand if A is better than B or whatever. It's more about, like I said, exploring a process or experience, or being as descriptive as possible. You're not looking to figure out what is true and what is not true. You're looking to work out what is there in front of you. So these are just ways in which you can collect and get qualitative data. So the first one is a survey. They're pretty bog standard. You'll see these quite often as quite commonly published in journals, because they're still, they can still add a layer of objectivity. You can have a good sample size, and they can be quite versatile, because you can often mix and match and get some qualitative and some quantitative answers, and that way it can be clear that these are views that are commonly held, or views that can be generalized beyond what the survey is, which adds to their credibility and adds to the fundamental value of the publication that is being generated. Despite, obviously, that's not necessarily the aim of every study, but it can be valuable in certain studies, in certain contexts, to answer specific research questions that may apply in multiple different settings. It may apply to different types of people. It may apply in different types of environments, or for whatever reason. So typically, you can basically, cross-sectional surveys come down to, you do the survey once, and at a given point in time, for everyone who answers that study, you have a list of things that they've answered, and you know that this is true for these people at the time of it being filled out. You can't make any kind of sweeping generalizations, and you can't assume that that will be true for any other time period other than when the data was collected, because people's thoughts or whatever, they're not permanent, and you can't assume that that would still apply 5 years down the line or even 2 weeks down the line. You don't know that. But that is exactly why people use things like longitudinal studies. So basically, all you're really changing in a longitudinal study is you're adding on a level of follow-up. It's the same thing, just repeated at different intervals. And over time, if things do change, if you ask them similar questions and the answers seem to change, then that should tell you if there's any variability or any adaptation to the respondents' attitudes or behaviors or thought processes. And there's no real limit on how longitudinal surveys are done. There have been some really, really good epidemiological kind of surveys that have been done where they've been collecting data from every 5 years for, I think, since the 70s and 80s. Obviously, as we've gone on, the surveys have become better, they've become more rich in detail, but fundamentally, some of the variables that were asked back in the 80s, you could theoretically follow up all the way till now. So it can be quite informative, and it's one of those things where you're looking for a change of pattern over time, but again, you can't prove anything. You can't say that these people used to think this and now because of X, Y, and Z, their attitudes have changed. Obviously, speculation and understanding the phenomenon and using contextual cues can be helpful, but there's no definitive proof. And the next type of kind of educational tool you can use here is an interview. An interview is basically the same thing as a survey, but in the sense that you're going to get the same kinds of data. However, an interview can be much more thorough. You have the time to get people's full responses, and you can say as much as they'd like or as little as they'd like, and you also get the added benefit of you can read into body language, you can read into the context behind how the interview is taking place and whatnot. There are certain nuances that will give you more information than just a simple survey. And however, equally, this is a lot more reliant on your kind of discourse with the interviewee. It can be a lot harder to standardize this because people just have different dynamics amongst themselves, and also because this one will require a bit more prep in terms of you have to be more well researched and more accurate. You've got to really try and do your best to make sure that the questions you're asking are valuable and they're definitely conducive to yielding the types of answers you want and the perspectives you want to understand from the people you're taking the time to interview. But other than that, like, the data itself could be the same kind of things you get from a survey, and equally it could be a far richer understanding of their perspectives and what they want to tell you. A systematic observation is basically just waiting and it's like being a fly on the wall. You're just gonna watch and take a grand perspective of a naturally occurring phenomenon or whatever is going on, and you're just going to take notes and you're just going to write down what you find, and that will be your study. The qualitative data you collect is just being a witness, basically. Your job is to be as neutral of a book as you can achieve. That's why it's so important to have specification of specific variables, and you've got to be super specific on what you're measuring, what you're recording, I should say, what exactly you're trying to learn and in which circumstances were those achieved, because there is no generalizability here. the more specific you can go, the better. But fundamentally, I think what you'll kind of appreciate with this is that it takes a lot of rigor and a lot of pre-preparation in terms of defining exactly what you want to find out from these people that you're taking the time to study and observe. And you've got to be very methodical with what you want to get out of this, because so people say the intent is to ensure that under the same or similar circumstances, all observers will obtain the same results. Obviously, your mileage may vary, but fundamentally, yes, you want to be sufficiently descriptive such that someone else in your situation should be able to describe something similar, because that's how you know that you did a good job. You know that you sat down, you patiently wrote down everything, you understood all the same variables, and provided that everything matches up, you would expect that phenomenon to be unchanged, and your account of it should also be unchanged. Okay, so but the beauty of qualitative research is you can often interchange and combine different things. So sometimes it's quite useful actually to do a bit of both. You can do observation, you can do interview, because that will give you different perspectives of what you're trying to understand. So for example, with that surgical experience I brought up earlier, it might be useful to go actually do all three, because you could observe the surgery and you can put down your own kind of systematic observation of it. But equally, you might find that sitting down and interviewing the surgeon and understanding their personal perspective may be useful. And in some situations, you might even find that to pick up things that are separate to both of those, you might wish to also look at the notes or other documentation that you've written about the surgery. And then you can kind of develop a rich understanding that comes from multiple different sources. And then, as a researcher, you have the luxury of being able to collate them and to create a diverse, but also fundamentally, it's kind of concomitant sources of information that yield the same answer, or the same answer from different perspectives. And it can also help you make more refined research, because let's say you've already observed the surgery or you've already seen the notes, then you will actually find that because you've got that insight, you can make better interview questions and you can do better research than if you had perhaps not done that before. If you didn't know that and you went in to do the interview, you might not have that specific knowledge. So it may be valuable for you to do that beforehand. But again, it really does depend on the specific nature of the talk, the interview you're doing, and what exactly you're trying to ask from them. Okay, so just to run through some of the advantages of qualitative research, it can give you a lot of depth and detail. You're not going to find that level of observational prowess in any kind of quantitative research, not routinely at least, because you're recording behaviors, feelings, thought process, decision making, things that often go unsaid in life. These are the types of things that people will kind of think about on their own somewhere, but you've got to kind of probe in and figure out what this means. And yeah, hence for the same reason, it creates openness, because you're going to encourage people to talk about things and to reveal perspectives that they may have that they wouldn't necessarily consider or that they wouldn't necessarily share. And that can be incredibly valuable as a tool to understand new knowledge about other people, but also how that reflects on ourselves. And it's why actually, if you read a lot of ethnographies, or if you read kind of qualitative research, sometimes you'll see like the you can kind of read almost the attitudes of the person. You can tell that they've kind of changed their mind about things, or they've learned something new here. And that can be, it's a good sign. Because if you're not learning something from the research you're doing, what's the point? Yeah. So then obviously the other thing is it can simulate individual experiences. That's something unique to something like the anthropology side or whatever. You can't do that in a lab. You couldn't do that in a clinical trial. It takes a level of, like I said, a level of independence from what you're working on to be able to just listen in and just observe and take in someone's unique experience and feelings and just document that as it is without any additional bias or anything that you may bring to the table. And hence why it's particularly good at avoiding kind of prejudgment. You can really kind of start to understand why people act the way they do. What can you learn from different situations, different people who may not behave in the same way as you do. But obviously, with this kind of descriptive nature and these, unyielding kind of ways of just taking the facts in and not being able to modify anything, there are obviously limitations. So generally, one thing that's quite common is the sample sizes. They're not, they can be quite limited. Often things like observations or case reports or whatever, they're not designed to be mass media. You're not expecting to get 1,000 people involved because that's counterintuitive. You can't, you can't get that level of data collection done. And at that level, in some research questions, it's not worth it because you're not going to learn anything new about perspectives by just excessively adding in more and more people to your study. Sometimes it's one of those things where less is more. And, if you can get a rich understanding of 10 people, it's better than getting a not so rich understanding of 100. But again, that can vary on the level of resources you have, what kind of study you're doing, and what kind of data collection can be achieved. Similarly, because of low sample sizes and things, and also just, again, the nature of the study, it can be quite difficult to generalize. In many cases, that's not a big problem because you're not looking to generalize, but fundamentally, because you're only describing an observation, you don't know if that observation can be seen again because it's the point of failure in some regards can become the researcher themselves, which is also the fourth point. It can be the case that for an observation or an interview, the biases and the level of detail and the understanding of that particular researcher becomes the breadth and the amount of knowledge that can be obtained by that researcher. If two people go off and do the same study, but one is a more proficient observer, it is likely that the data collected by that person is more valuable and more accurate than one who is less proficient. But now you have two sets of data that do not look the same, despite the fact that they're measuring the same thing. The fundamental human fallibility and, the fact that it takes a lifetime to train an anthropologist, but not everyone, you don't get a lifetime of practice before you go into the field. So things do go wrong and things can be missed, and some accounts just aren't as good as others. And that's something that you have to bear in mind. So it's important that as a researcher or as someone who's going to read research, you need to be thinking about, the kind of iterative process of how I'm going to collect my data, how I'm going to write about it, how I'm going to make sure that it is as accurate as physically possible, and how I can verify that it's trustworthy, it's going to resonate with the right type of things I'm trying to study, and is it actually sufficient to allow me to make any of the judgments or the conclusions that I'm going to make? These are all kind of things that can be challenging, but will really make or break the value of what you're trying to achieve. So now that I've kind of talked about what can be limiting or beneficial about qualitative research, I'm going to briefly touch upon what kind of things you can do to analyze qualitative research. We'll have a separate talk on the analysis itself, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically I just want to kind of start off by saying that, again, the methods of analysis are fundamentally comparative and inductive. So inductive in the sense that you're not trying to deduce anything, you're trying to build knowledge from the data itself. You're trying to learn and build up your framework from the data you have, whereas deduction is more kind of proving something. It's like you're trying to answer a question. In this case, there is, as paradoxical as it might sound, but sometimes there is no question. You're going from something specific and then generalizing out, rather than trying to go for a really specific question, which can be answered from a more broad data set. Hence why this is always called bottom-up reasoning, because you're literally going to build from specific things and add more and more onto your framework. So again, given the subjective nature of your analysis, it's super important to be as descriptive as possible. And what you often find in the framework of medicine is what's often achieved is something called the thematic analysis. So basically, this kind of comes down to 4 key steps. So your first one will be, you're gonna collect your data, you're going to identify your codes and your themes. So the way I was always taught to think about a code and a theme is, a code is like a brick. So it's just something that is an insight from the data you've got. Whereas a theme is a wall. It's like you put all the codes together, this is your final big picture kind of resolution from the data you have. So often there's kind of obvious patterns you're going to look for. So like I said, with the whole example that I gave earlier about virtual versus in-person teaching, what you might find is that some of the key themes that arise are the time taken to commute, or the investment required to in-person teaching that is not required for virtual teaching, because you don't have to be there, it's more convenient, etc. Then you might find that people will bring up personal things such as money, or having to they might not have great internet or whatever. Those would be kind of specific codes, because those are just insights that aren't necessarily as central to your question. But I hope that kind of gives you a bit of a flavor of what can be useful. I want to kind of introduce you to this paper. This is a paper I found while I was kind of preparing this. It's very, very useful. I think it's a good review to kind of start you off, but there are plenty of other things that you can also read, and hopefully if you understand this to some level, and then obviously you can build on it, and if you want to pursue a qualitative research project in the future, it will be helpful for you to just have seen this and get that understanding from building your way up in a way that might be appropriate for something inductive of its nature anyway. But yeah, I'll leave this on the screen for a bit, so if you want to wrote it down or something. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions, and thanks for listening.
Great. So thanks so much, Niraj. So yeah, as said, the form has been put on the the link to the feedback form has been put onto the chat. So let me know if you guys can access that. If you guys can't access it, I'll just resend it on the chat. But if any of you guys have any questions, feel free to put it on the chat. Right. So I think from the looks of things, I don't think there seems to be any questions. So I think are we okay to wrap it up here?
Yeah, I mean, give people a few minutes
Sure.
to fill out feedback and stuff. But yeah, honestly, if you guys do have any questions or anything else you want to discuss about any research or whatever, obviously take the time to answer any questions now. But obviously, you'll feel free to kind of email, get in touch, and we can kind of just discuss things virtually as well.